One of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is because there is so much information out there about food. And, you and I think, are both health conscious people, try to practice what we preach. And yet it can be confusing. So I wanted to come to the guy who's actually done a lot of the hard work in this area. And it is hard work to do food studies. I mean, we'll talk about that as well. It's just so striking to me how much advice, quote unquote, there is out there. And I'm just curious, just broadly speaking, you've been at this for a long time. How do you see this sort of the rise of the wellness influencer talking about what you should eat, when you should eat, all that sort of stuff? How has that changed and how has that affected your work?
Right. It's been really fascinating to see this. What used to be, there's a very long history of people thinking they'd figured out, the truth about food and nutrition and how best to eat. Yeah. And this has kind of been happening for centuries in nutrition science. But the magnitude of the information that we now have and people with very large platforms having extremely strong opinions, thinking they've got it all figured out and might make very bold claims like you've been lied to in the past by scientists and the government and whoever else is underlying the nefarious food industry. And basically basing sometimes very sensible advice, sometimes not so sensible advice, and often a kernel of truth, which has been well founded scientifically. And then they run with that and oftentimes think that they've got the entire explanation. And I think the frustrating thing from a scientist perspective is that oftentimes that is treated as fact, and very few people go about testing those ideas, right? Actually saying, okay, this is a really intriguing model of how we think the human body works in relation to specific kinds of diets and foods. Let's go out and figure out if it's true. Because it doesn't matter how compelling your story is and how much you've convinced yourself and your followers that this is the truth. Science doesn't work that way, right? That's just the first step of the scientific process, is that you think you got something figured out and now we have to go and test it. And that, I think, is the frustrating part, right? Is because for centuries, literally, people have thought they had it figured out. And because nutrition has always been a topic that's fascinated people and people have always wanted to eat the best that they could for their health, they rush to the public in the market with their ideas and trying to convince people that previous folks have got it all wrong. We finally figured it out. This is now the magic bullet for health and wellness.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. And I think if you add other layers onto it, which is that, by the way, going back to when I first started doing this job, the debate was often around low fat or low carb.
Right.
That was the debate. And there were some studies that showed even if you ate a low carb, sort of higher fat diet, maybe it would lower your cholesterol levels, lower your weight, body weight, things like that. So, there was some data, but it is amazing to me how it has really just spun out over the last 10 years. And, just to be totally candid about it, the people who are trying to influence you online, they stand to make money often either through their social media platforms or through selling products and things like that. So there's other things at play here that didn't used to be at play before. You could give advice, but you weren't necessarily monetizing that advice, and now people are. So the more audacious or outlandish the claim, the better in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Let me ask you some basic questions. Metabolism is at the heart of, I think, this entire discussion, how we metabolize food. What is metabolism?
Yeah, metabolism is one of the things that most people don't really know about. They kind of think it has something to do with how much food we can eat without gaining weight or something like that. Metabolism is just this incredible biochemical process that basically turns the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe into, essentially, as my friend Charles Brenner says, into everything we are and everything we do. It's really that fundamental to life. It's harnessing the continuous flow of matter and energy in our food and in our breath, and powering every cell in our body, as well as the bodies and cells of practically every organism that we have ever encountered. It's a fundamental component of life. And it's just incredibly fascinating. It's something that's kind of captured the attention of philosophers and physicians for millennia of this. What is this relationship between the fire of life and the breath of life, and how does that work inside the body, and how is it that we're not just wasting away? Like, what is it that keeps us? What is it that builds us? And I just find it incredibly frustrating sometimes that this idea of metabolism, this really beautiful physiological process that is so fundamental to life, is kind of talked about as, oh, well, if you take this supplement, you can boost your metabolism and lose weight, or metabolism is the thing that keeps you from losing weight. And so much misinformation about metabolism, and it's something that has really distracted people, I think, from the real beauty of what this is and how fundamental it is to life itself.
Is there a fundamental misconception, do you think, just in your years of research, is there a fundamental misconception people have about metabolism?
Yeah, I think that the fundamental misconception that I've seen over and over again, and again, it gets to some of the science and how it's evolved, was the idea that people with obesity have a slow metabolism.
Right.
And there are some people, that's true of a minority of people with obesity, but generally, larger people have faster metabolisms than smaller people. And it's only when we started to really quantify the overall metabolic rate of a human in a careful way and of a wide variety of people that we realized that, because the way that sort of myth entered into the lexicon, which has kind of continued to this day, came from basically asking people what they ate and trying to kind of work out, well, if they ate this much, and then we can figure out how many calories are in the foods, that's the sort of energy content of the foods that they're eating. Then if you just look at how much people with obesity say that they eat versus how much someone who's lean says that they eat, it turns out that the number of calories seems to be relatively less in the people with obesity. And I think what we now understand is that for whatever reason, it's very difficult. Number one, they're all underreporting the amount of calories that they're eating. It's one of those things that's very difficult for people and nutritionists and scientists even to quantify how many calories people are eating just by monitoring their diets or asking them to keep diet records or asking them to say how much of certain kinds of foods they eat in the past. But the problem is that error is actually correlated with body size. So people with obesity make larger mistakes. Now, we don't know why. It could be that they have a more difficult time estimating portion size. But that error in our measurements for many, many years before we were making direct measurements of metabolism led people to a conclusion that, well, if they're eating less calories and they're maintaining their weight, then they must be burning less calories. And maybe the reason why they have obesity is because they have slow metabolisms. And then came a bunch of studies that said, well, actually, when we actually directly measure people's metabolisms, people with obesity have higher metabolic rates on average than people who are lean. So this mythology has kind of persisted for a very long period of time. And the idea that treating obesity should be about boosting metabolism has kind of persisted. And in fact, that kind of came about with one of the most effective weight loss drugs that happened around the turn of the 20th century, which actually led in part to the FDA being one of the first drugs that was banned from folks, because it actually did boost metabolism. It also caused a lot of deaths and blindness. And maybe it shouldn't be too much of a surprise later to realize that with something so fundamentally important to life as metabolism, you can't just turn it up and turn it down with a pharmaceutical drug and not expect some pretty severe side effects, including death. But yeah, it's a fascinating kind of mythology, which has, again, a long history.
Just putting aside the potential side effects for a second, if you gave a medication that boosted someone's metabolism, like a speed-type medication, phentermine or something like that, would it cause people to lose weight? And if so, why?
It probably would for a while. Probably not as much as you would expect. And in fact, people have done similar studies without actually messing with metabolism. What if you just leaked out more calories? So that there's a class of type 2 diabetes drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors, which basically make it so that you're peeing out more calories in your urine. And you can do that to the tune of 300 to 400 calories a day in your urine. So it has the same net effect, right? You're basically using up those calories for something. It's not to produce heat or to fuel metabolism, but you're leaking out those calories. And yeah, those folks start to lose weight, but they lose relatively little weight, like less than 10 pounds on average. And the reason is that it seems like, for whatever reason, as weight loss proceeds as a result of leaking out these calories, our appetite goes up. And in a very subconscious way, we end up making up for those lost calories by eating more food. Not that they are consciously recognizing this or intending to do so. It was a placebo-controlled randomized trial. And folks who are on this drug and they're peeing out all these calories and glucose are slowly, as they lose weight, ramping up the number of calories that they're eating in a very subtle and slow way over months, so that they end up reaching a plateau of weight loss. Again, like I said, less than 10 pounds by the time at 1 year mark hits. And these drugs aren't perfectly benign. They increase urinary tract infection rates, but they also are quite safe for people with type 2 diabetes. They're widely used and they're very effective. But as a weight loss indication, it suggests that, if you were able to boost metabolism by a similar amount, right, 300 to 400 calories a day, that's a full meal, you wouldn't expect that much weight loss. You'd expect, less than 10 pounds on average. So boosting metabolism, even by a relatively large amount, like 300 to 400 calories per day, I don't think would be a blockbuster in terms of a weight loss drug.
Does our metabolism change as we age?
That's a really interesting question. And the latest data suggests that the answer is not as much as we initially thought. So,
because I have teenagers, and that you hear this as well. They seemingly can eat whatever they want and never seem to gain weight. But me, different story.
I know. It's really interesting. And yeah, that has been a common idea for a very long period of time. And so there was a very large study conducted. It was basically a cross-sectional study, meaning that they're getting people with a wide variety of ages, and they're measuring how many calories they're burning over time, and they're measuring how much of their body is fat versus lean mass. And once you adjust for the fat and the lean mass, it turns out that until you get to very advanced ages, we're talking 70s and 80s, it looks like our metabolic rate is roughly constant once we adjust for those things. However, as you also probably know, our body composition does tend to change with age. So that's after you've adjusted for the fact that people, as they age, past the age of 30 or so, are tending to lose muscle mass, or tending to lose lean mass, and they're tending to gain fat mass. And that alone is anticipated to result in a lower metabolism. But once you get rid of that effect, there's no it doesn't seem like there's a fundamental aging effect to slow metabolism as we get older.
I just want to put a punctuation mark on this point, because I think there is this conceit that as we get older, all these things change in our bodies. And yes, they can and they do, but it's more within our control than we realize. I read this study even about runners, and they found, a lot of times when you're looking at data around athletes, you're looking at uber athletes, elite athletes, but just for average athletes, runners, they found that in fact their speeds at which they were running a mile didn't actually go down that much between age 35 and 65. For people who ran regularly.
Right.
But a lot of times people say, well, I can't possibly run as fast as I ran when I was 35. Well, when is the last time you ran?
Yeah,
have you been running consistently? So if you continue to do the same things that you did when you were younger, you may be able to maintain a lot of that lean muscle mass, decreased body fat. And that is really, I think, what you're saying, Dr. Hall, what is a bigger indicator of what your metabolism is likely to be. You write in the book about the popular 3,500 calorie myth. The idea that because a pound is 3,500 calories, if you cut 500 calories out a day, you'll lose about a pound per week. Why is that wrong?
Yeah. So, it's a fascinating sort of rule of thumb that's existed for decades. And it's wrong because it assumes that there's basically nothing happens inside the body. So the 3,500 calorie per pound rule basically says that, okay, if you cut the number of calories in your diet, nothing happens to the number of calories you're burning. And we just make up the difference by losing body fat. And we lose it at this sort of linear rate, kind of like if you had a banking account and you didn't have any interest fees or weren't making any interest. Basically, the amount that's in the bank account is going to go up or down depending on your withdrawals and deposits in exactly that proportion. But the body does something much more clever, like we were mentioning. As people lose weight, their metabolism slows down. And as people lose weight, their appetite goes up. And as a result, this kind of assumption that nothing happens to either your appetite or the number of calories that you're burning is completely false. And unfortunately, I wish it was just like a cute little rule of thumb that was used by, some weight loss folks back in the day. But this kind of idea really perpetuated this myth that really small changes in your diet can lead to big changes in body weight over time. And that is really stigmatizing to people with obesity in particular. Like, why can't you just cut out a soda a day? Because if you cut out a soda a day, you would lose 50 pounds in a year. What's wrong with you? Why don't you have that level of willpower? And it just completely ignores the basic biology, which is resisting weight loss in a given food environment, and has really perpetuated this myth that people are really to blame, that it's entirely within their control to kind of change these things. And there are people who can make big changes, but they need to make big changes, not small changes, in order to kind of lose a lot of weight and keep it off.
And I think just sort of putting this together, both from the metabolism standpoint and the calories consumed standpoint, is this idea that maybe in the short term, boosting metabolism or decreasing calories can help you lose weight, but the body starts to acclimate to that. And so if you've cut calories, your body may start to lower metabolism as well. So even if you lose weight in the short term, it won't be sort of sustainable, I think is what you're saying. So what is the answer there? If boosting metabolism is not going to lead to long-term weight loss and decreasing calories won't do it, what are people to take away from that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of messages. One is that it's not hopeless, that if you can make sustained changes in your lifestyle and you have a supportive environment, supportive spouse, maybe a stable job that is allowing you to kind of shift your habits and shift your sort of local environment in ways that allow you to make those changes in a sustained way, then yeah, you can be successful. And there's lots of success stories that people can trot out on diet A versus diet B, or workout program C versus workout program D. There's all sorts of ways that if you can really make those sustained changes in lifestyle, then yeah, that's certainly a viable approach for many people. The problem is that most folks don't have the time, the energy, the commitment. They are undergoing life changes. And yeah, it's really important to do these things, but they're doing it in the face of a food environment that has shifted to such a dramatic degree that they really have to exert a lot of individual effort and expense in order to do this. Now, some people, like I said, they have figured it out. They've figured out what changes they can make in their day-to-day life, and they can stick with it for the rest of their lives, and they're happy, and they can have a lot of success, and more power to them. But, the fact that we've experienced, this large increase in prevalence of obesity over the past several decades is not because of a failure of willpower, right? And it's not because of changes in our genes. People who are genetically susceptible to a change in our environment, and in particular our food environment, have gained the most weight over the course of the past several decades. And so we can have a lot of success at the individual level. We've had drugs now that are very effective in treating people with obesity and having them lose enormous amounts of weight and keeping it off and improving their health even beyond the weight loss by mechanisms that are really fascinating to try to unpack. But from a societal level, we're doing this on the background of a shift in our food environment that has caused the problem in the first place. And so it's not an either or. I mean, we need to treat people with obesity and we need to kind of take care of their health. And we need to invest in those kinds of medications that will help them. But we also need to address again, some of the root cause of why we ended up in this place in the first place, which is this change of our food environment. And in particular, I think one of the things that folks are now honing in on is the rise of ultra-processed foods and how they are affecting our bodies and our appetites and our brains.
I think as a general rule, ultra-processed foods, if you hear that term, it's sort of a four-letter word now, right? But people are like, that's something I should avoid. But what can we say about them? You don't want to use the term addiction when talking about these foods, because you don't see the same changes in the brain that you see with other addiction. Do ultra-processed foods, though, cause you to overeat?
So this is a great question. And I would say the answer is yes and no. Yes and no in the way that not all ultra-processed foods are the same. This idea that many of the ultra-processed foods that are particularly problematic when it comes to weight gain or eating too many calories also tend to have too much sodium. They tend to have too much saturated fat, too much added sugar. They tend to be low in fiber and whole grains and whole foods in general, tend to be low in veggies and fruits and legumes and all the things that we kind of have standard sort of knowledge about nutrition, about what makes a healthy versus an unhealthy food. So from that extent, there's a lot of overlap with what we already know. And then there's a whole bunch of ultra-processed foods that are probably neutral for health, right? They probably don't kind of generate problematic outcomes one way or another. And then there's, I would argue, a bunch that are probably healthy for you. They actually meet the new FDA definition of a healthy food, which is kind of based on those more fundamental principles that we were just talking about. Do they have whole foods? Do they have whole grains? Do they have fruits and vegetables? Do they contain a low amount of sodium, a low amount of saturated fat, a high amount of fiber? All those things that we think about as being health qualities of foods. I eat ultra-processed foods that kind of meet those standards for the most part, or at least I try to. But they're ultra-processed because they typically are kind of microwavable ready meals, and they have to have a certain amount of food technology that allows those meals to kind of heat up properly in a microwave without making them, inedible after the fact. So they contain chemicals and agents in them that qualify them as ultra-processed foods. Maybe those have damaging properties, but from most traditional aspects of nutrition, they are healthy products. And so I think we need to kind of be wary of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to classifying all ultra-processed foods as things that we want to get rid of, when in fact many of them can be really healthy alternatives, right? Again, it's the question of what are you replacing it with, right? I mean, if I'm replacing my lunch with one of these things, which I normally would have had a burger, right, and fries, even if they're fried in beef tallow and not seed oils, I'm going to argue that my ready meal is going to be healthier for me, right? And it doesn't matter if my burger and fries are not ultra processed.
So there seems to be two things you're talking about here. One is weight gain, but the other is just, is there harm from eating ultra-processed foods in general on your health? One of the things that people hear often is if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. And if you flip these labels over and start to pronounce these various chemicals that are in ultra-processed foods, many of them you can't pronounce. I mean, how do you think about that? I mean, is that good advice to say, look, if you flip the label over and you can't pronounce these terms, you probably shouldn't eat it? Or it sounds like maybe you're not saying that because there are certain ultra-processed foods that you think are at least neutral.
Yeah, no, I think that, so I think, again, we have to think about who the audience is here, right? I mean, if you are a person who has the privilege and wherewithal and the interest, and you have your backyard garden and your personal chef, and you want to avoid all ultra-processed foods and have freshly prepared meals from scratch every day, and you know how to do it, and you're willing to pay for it, then I don't think it's bad advice to remove ultra-processed foods from your diet. It's part of the precautionary principle, right? That would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And so I don't begrudge those folks who say, you should just, eat food, eat plants, not too much, the Michael Pollan kind of idea, and avoid the Franken foods, the things that you can't pronounce. But of course, if I presented you with the list of chemicals in an egg, many of those chemicals you won't be able to pronounce. Now they weren't added there; they're natural chemicals. We're made of chemicals, right? That's so we shouldn't be stirring chemophobia. And many of the vitamins have names that most people can't pronounce. In fact, I think there's videos of folks at the Health and Human Services Maha Moms event with pronouncing vitamin names that they couldn't pronounce. So
that's a good point.
And,
I saw
yeah,
that.
we need them, right? But I think. So yeah, okay, that's a perfectly fine for the privileged folks, right?
Okay.
That can do this. The question is, we have to feed a population. We have to feed a population a healthy diet. We have to feed the population a sustainable diet, and the food supply has to provide that in a way that is sustainable for farmers. It's a way that's sustainable for people and in institutional settings, schools and other institutional settings, and we have to be able to feed people who don't have the wherewithal to do these things. And I'm one of those people, right? I still eat ultra processed foods, but I use my knowledge of nutrition science to choose foods that meet my budget, that meet my time commitments, that meet my skill level when it comes to cooking, and use those as part of a healthy diet. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to also target the kinds of foods that are in our food supply that are generating many of the problems that we see.
You talk about this and describe it really well in the book, Food Intelligence. I really hope everyone gets a chance to read this book. It's easy to look at these issues in isolation and say, a person weighs too much, they need to cut 500 calories a day, and et cetera. But to put it in the larger context of what has happened historically, what is likely to happen in the future, what is happening with the climate, all of that, when it comes to food, you have to think about all of that and again, make it real for people in terms of how they eat in their daily lives. If you were in a position of power with regard to our health system in this country, with what we know now, again, we always should be researching this more and doing more studies, but with what we know now, what would you do with regard to our food supply?
Yeah, well, with regard to our food supply, I mean, I think that I would be investing a lot in, and there have been some investments, some relatively modest investments by the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, to figure out, what sustainable agricultural practices might look like to still be able to produce, sustainable high yields of crops, but doing it in a way that doesn't depend as much on fossil fuel use, as much as artificial fertilizer and over-fertilization, that are more sustainable and regenerative in terms of the soil. And how do we do that carefully? Because there have been some countries that have tried to do this, again, without the right research in a dramatic way. Sri Lanka was one country that basically banned artificial fertilizer use overnight and didn't do the right experiments for their farmers, and they saw a huge reduction in yields. Food prices skyrocketed, and there was a huge economic problem that resulted. In America, I think we can do that more intelligently and put the right incentives in place for farmers to figure out what works and institute the metrics to make those measurements. I also think that we need to change the way that we regulate our food at the FDA. I mean, the FDA has gone to a lot of expense and effort to define what a healthy food looks like. And they did that to basically make a voluntary label that manufacturers could use to put on the front of their products saying FDA healthy. Well, that's great. What if we, instead of making it just a voluntary program, what if we started to institute policies that would take certain categories of foods that didn't meet the FDA healthy program and were maybe ultra processed and maybe had other properties, like they're really high in energy density or were deemed hyper palatable, which might make them more addictive, and basically tried to tax those foods. That was the most effective policy that reduced tobacco consumption, was taxation. That could be our target. If it's ultra processed, does not meet the FDA definition of healthy, and it's hyper palatable and energy dense, it gets a tax. And then we actually have to then support the replacements that are healthy alternatives, make those kinds of ultra processed products. Right now, those ready meals, for example, that I eat that have that could qualify for an FDA healthy label, they're a heck of a lot more expensive right now. How do we subsidize those foods? How do we make them better and more widely available, and make them as convenient and tasty and healthy options? How can we incentivize that? How could we, for example, the average U.S. supermarket, the average diet quality of the average grocery cart that comes out of them is not meeting anywhere near the dietary guidelines for Americans. What if we incentivize grocery stores with a tax break if the average purchase from the store met certain health guidelines? That would exert, enormous upstream influences on manufacturers to improve the healthfulness of their products. There's a whole suite we have an entire chapter on this in the book of ideas that we could institute immediately to actually change the food supply and exert pressures on the food economy in ways that would improve the healthfulness of diets, and in terms of agricultural experiments that we could do to really start to make these shifts that we know we have to make anyway.
Which probably would make a difference not just in the short term, but the long term as well, which I think was a theme that I really gathered when I was reading your book. Well, I really appreciate your time. I hope to stay in touch. Good luck with the book. I think it's going to be wildly successful, because I think people are so interested in this topic. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you.